I recall that summer when I chose to take a solo trip to a small cabin in the woods. I needed some time to clear my thoughts, and I believed a bit of solitude would do the trick. After searching online, I found a cabin deep in the forest, miles away from any town. It looked ideal, quiet, surrounded by trees, and most importantly, secluded. The drive was long and meandering, but I finally arrived in the late afternoon. The cabin was even more charming up close. It was small but inviting, with a wooden porch and a perfect view of the dense woods. After unpacking my belongings, I decided to explore the area a little before the sun disappeared behind the trees. I wandered into the woods, taking in the crisp air and listening to the sounds of nature. Everything felt serene until I walked further in. Suddenly, the forest went quiet. I had this odd sensation that someone might be watching me. I told myself it was just my imagination and headed back toward the cabin. That night, I struggled to get a full night's sleep. I kept hearing noises, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, and what sounded like footsteps. I convinced myself that it was probably just animals, but I couldn't shake the unease. Eventually, I managed to drift into a light sleep. I woke abruptly in the middle of the night. The cabin was completely dark. I reached for my flashlight and shone it around the room. Everything seemed fine, but the sensation of being watched felt stronger than before. I checked all the windows and doors. They were locked and secure. The next morning, I tried to relax. I read a book, made some coffee, and sat on the porch, but that strange feeling of discomfort lingered. Hoping to clear my head, I decided to take another walk. This time, I chose a different path and came across an old, abandoned campsite. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. A fire pit and rusted camping gear were all that remained. The sight sent a shiver down my spine, and I hurried back toward the cabin. That night, the noises returned. They were louder this time, closer. My heart pounded as I listened to the sound of movement just beyond the edge of the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and my phone, but quickly realized there was no signal. I felt trapped. A sudden loud bang came from the porch. My stomach dropped. I shone the flashlight toward the door, but there was only darkness. The banging grew more intense, more aggressive. I knew I had to face whatever was out there. I grabbed a heavy flashlight as an improvised weapon and cautiously opened the door. To my surprise, no one was there. The porch was empty, but that suffocating feeling of being observed still lingered. I stepped outside and scanned the surrounding woods with my flashlight. Everything was still again. I stood there, heart racing, struggling to make sense of it. Then I saw movement, a shadow shifting among the trees. I aimed the flashlight, but I only caught brief glimpses of it. I couldn't stay there any longer. Grabbing the few essentials I could, I jumped into my car and sped away. Looking back, I could see the cabin as just a dark silhouette against the forest backdrop. Relief washed over me as I hit the main road, where the familiar sounds of traffic and the presence of people felt comforting. I didn't stop until I was back in the nearest town. Later, I learned that the area around that cabin had a strange reputation. Visitors had reported feelings of being watched and hearing unexplained sounds over the years. Nothing harmful ever came of it, but it seemed that the woods themselves carried an unsettling presence. I've never returned to that cabin. The whole experience left me shaken. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I still hear the faint sound of leaves rustling and footsteps in the distance. And sometimes I wonder, did something follow me back from those woods? I really enjoyed camping. It was the perfect way to escape the noise of the city and reconnect with the outdoors. So, when I had an extended weekend, I packed my gear and drove to a peaceful campsite in the mountains. The location was secluded, exactly how I preferred, with only a handful of other campers scattered about. I arrived in the early evening and quickly set up my tent. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the trees in hues of golden orange. After a quick dinner, I decided to explore the nearby trails. The forest was dense with towering trees and underbrush. The sounds of birds and leaves swaying in the breeze gave the place a lively energy. As I ventured further into the woods, I noticed it was getting dark faster than expected. I checked my watch. It was only 6 p.m., but the thick canopy of trees blocked most of the sunlight. I figured I should head back to my camp before it became too dark. On my way back, I noticed something strange on the ground. A small, weathered backpack, partially buried in dirt. I bent down, pulling it out, and looked inside. There were old, moldy clothes and a few rusted camping tools. It looked like it had been abandoned for many years. I wondered who might have left it and why. As I continued walking, a strange feeling lingered. I felt as though someone might be watching me. Every sound, the snap of a branch or a rustle in the bushes, sent a jolt of anxiety through me. I kept glancing behind me but saw nothing. By the time I reached my campsite, night had almost fully fallen. I started a small fire and sat by it, attempting to calm my nerves. The fire's warmth and light offered some comfort, but unease lingered. My thoughts kept returning to the strange backpack and the feeling of being watched. I decided to call it an early night, crawling into my tent and zipping it up securely. The sounds of the forest felt louder now, the wind rustling through branches and the occasional call of an owl. I struggled to sleep, every little noise pulling me further into a state of tension. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside my tent. They were slow and deliberate, stepping over twigs and leaves. My heart leapt into my throat. I held my breath, straining to hear more, but then the footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I could make out a shadow through the thin fabric, a figure standing there. Paralyzed by fear, I reached for my flashlight and switched it on, shining the beam at the tent wall. The shadow vanished. I unzipped the tent, shining the light outside, but it was empty. Only the dark forest and the faint glow of my campfire greeted me. I didn't sleep much for the rest of the night, sitting by the fire, keeping it alive until the first rays of dawn. As soon as it was light, I packed up my gear and left. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might be following me during the entire drive home. When I arrived, I looked into the area's history and found an old news article about a hiker who had vanished years ago. They never found him, only his backpack, the same one I had come across in the woods. That discovery left me shaken, and I never returned to that campsite. The whole experience taught me to be more mindful of my surroundings and trust my instincts. Sometimes, the scariest things aren't monsters or ghosts but the unknown, lurking just beyond sight. Months later, I received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single photograph of my campsite, taken from the edge of the woods. On the back of the photo were the words, handwritten in shaky script, "I found you. I moved to another city soon after, hoping to leave my fears behind. But every now and then, I get a strange feeling that I'm being watched. A reminder that some mysteries are better left unexplored." I chose to go camping alone to clear my mind. Work had been rough, and I had just gone through a breakup. I felt the need to disconnect from everything. I drove to a remote mountain area, far from the nearest people, a spot my father had brought me to during my childhood. I thought revisiting it would help me find some peace. I arrived in the late afternoon and set up my tent near a small clearing by a stream. The sounds of birds singing and the water rushing over rocks were soothing, and they started to calm my anxious thoughts. I gathered some wood and built a fire, feeling the tension from recent months slowly leave me. As darkness took over, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in years. The air turned colder as night set in, and the forest around me became a deep, inky black. The fire's glow cast moving shadows on nearby trees. I was used to being alone on camping trips and didn't mind the solitude. I sat by the fire, lost in my thoughts, until the flames began to dwindle. It must have been near midnight when I decided to go to bed. I climbed into my tent and zipped up my sleeping bag, allowing the quiet of the forest to lull me to sleep. It was a heavy, soundless sleep, the kind you only have when you're exhausted. I woke up abruptly, my heart pounding. Something was outside the tent. I could hear careful, quiet footsteps crunching over the leaves. I stayed still, trying to rationalize it. Maybe a deer or a raccoon, but I couldn't shake the sharp fear that kept me motionless. The footsteps came closer and then stopped just outside my tent. I could hear a faint rustling, and then the unmistakable sound of a zipper being slowly tugged open. The tent was being unzipped. My breath hitched as I quickly grabbed the flashlight by my side and switched it on, pointing it toward the entrance. The sound of the zipper stopped. I yelled out, hoping to scare off whatever was there. No response, only stillness. Summoning every ounce of bravery, I unzipped the tent and shone the flashlight outside. There was nothing, no person, no animal, just the dark forest. I stepped out, flashlight in hand, gripping a heavy branch in the other, and began to scan the area. The light cut through the shadows, but I found no signs of anyone or anything. Shaken, I returned to my tent and stayed awake for the remainder of the night, jumping at every sound, every rustle of leaves. When dawn came, I packed up my things and left the campsite, feeling a mix of relief and lingering anxiety. It wasn't until I returned home that I realized something strange. My backpack, which I had left inside the tent, was missing its small first aid kit. It wasn't a detail I would usually think much of, but I always kept it in the same pocket, and now it was gone. I couldn't figure out what had happened, but the unease lingered. A few weeks later, as I scrolled through the news, I came across a story about a missing hiker found dead near the same area where I had camped. Reports said he had injuries that suggested he had been attacked. They found a first aid kit in his hand, one that matched the description of mine. After that, I never went camping alone again. The woods have always fascinated me. There's something about being surrounded by trees and nature, far from the chaos of city life, that draws me in. So when a friend mentioned a secluded camping spot, I knew I had to check it out. I packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, food, and supplies and set out early. The drive was long, twisting through dense forests and climbing up mountain paths. Eventually, I arrived at the destination. The spot was tucked far away, with no visible roads or trails leading to it. It was exactly the kind of isolation I had been looking for. Setting up camp was second nature by now. Soon, I had a fire burning, and the smell of dinner filled the cool evening air. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, I settled into the stillness, enjoying the calm. But as darkness enveloped the area, a feeling of discomfort crept in. Every crack of leaves or snap of a twig felt louder and closer. I tried to dismiss it, blaming my imagination, and crawled into my sleeping bag. Sleep wouldn't come. I tossed and turned, every little sound pulling me closer to paranoia. Then, in the dead of the night, I heard it, a low, guttural growl that sent a jolt through my body. My heart raced as I strained to figure out where it came from, but it seemed to come from all directions at once. Fear took hold of me, leaving me unable to move. Minutes felt like hours as I lay motionless in the darkness, the growling continuing before suddenly stopping. The silence afterward was intense and unnerving, broken only by the sound of my own heartbeat. As the first rays of sunlight broke over the trees, I hastily packed up my gear and headed out. Relief washed over me with every mile I drove, putting distance between myself and whatever presence haunted those woods. To this day, I can't shake the memory of that night. Fear still lingers, a constant reminder of the dark, unseen threats that may wait in the woods. As much as I've tried to tell myself otherwise, I know that part of me will always carry the weight of that fear. One weekend, I made up my mind to go on a solo hike in the hills. I needed to clear my thoughts and figured some time in the fresh air would do me good. I picked a trail that wasn't very crowded but was said to have stunning views, according to an online post I had come across. The weather was ideal when I set off. The trail was narrow and wound through dense woods. As I progressed, the surroundings grew quieter. All I could hear were my footsteps and the occasional sound of rustling leaves. After hiking for a couple of hours, I reached a spot with an incredible view of the valley below. I decided to take a break and have a small snack. While I sat there, I noticed the sky was becoming darker. When I checked my watch, I realized it was later than I had planned, so I knew I needed to head back. I stood up and started making my way down the path. The forest seemed thicker than I remembered. I was certain I was still on the right path, but after walking for about an hour, nothing around me looked familiar. I tried to stay calm, thinking I just needed to keep going. Eventually, I reached a fork in the trail that I didn't recall passing earlier. I hesitated but chose the path that appeared more worn. However, as I walked further, the trail began to fade and was no longer clear. Panic started to set in. My phone had no signal, and the daylight was quickly fading. I decided to retrace my steps back to the fork. While I walked, I heard the low rumble of thunder in the distance. I knew I needed to find some kind of shelter. After a short while, I spotted a small hollow in the rocks that looked like it could provide some protection. I crouched inside and waited out the storm. Rain pounded outside as I sat in the cave, cold, soaked, and frightened. I realized I couldn't stay there all night. Once the storm had passed, I ventured out again, hoping to find my way back to the trail. After what felt like hours of stumbling in the dark, I saw a faint light flickering through the trees. My heart leaped. I hoped it was a campsite. I moved toward the light and soon realized it was a small wooden cabin. Relief washed over me. I knocked on the door, and an older man answered. He looked just as surprised to see me as I was to find him. He let me in, handed me a towel, and allowed me to use his phone to call for help. I explained my situation, and he assured me I was safe. The next morning, search and rescue arrived. They guided me back to the main trail and escorted me to my car. As I drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about how fortunate I was to find that cabin. The experience reminded me how quickly things can take a wrong turn in the wilderness and how crucial it is to be well prepared. A few days later, I shared the story of my hike and the cabin with a friend. His expression turned serious as he asked me to describe the cabin and the man I had met. When I did, his face went pale. He told me that there hadn't been any cabins in that area for years. They had all been abandoned and demolished after a string of unexplained disappearances. A chill ran through me as I considered the possibility that I might have spent the night in a place that shouldn't exist. Weeks later, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. When I answered, a voice whispered, "You weren't meant to leave." The line went dead. I froze, a cold sweat breaking out as I realized my ordeal might not be truly over. I planned to explore a secluded trail I had come across in an online guide. Promised stunning vistas and a challenging trek. Setting out just after dawn, I brought along a map, some snacks, and plenty of water. The first stretch was serene. Birds chirped, and sunlight filtered gently through the forest canopy. Around the midpoint, the trail became difficult. The path narrowed, and the incline grew steeper. I had to focus on each step to avoid stumbling. After another mile, I entered a dense woodland. The trees stood so close together that barely any sunlight pierced through. leaving the air cooler and the quiet almost oppressive. As I ventured deeper into the forest, an uneasy sensation settled in my gut, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Shaking off the feeling, I pressed forward. Half an hour later, I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in a while. Pulling out my map, I tried to orient myself, but everything around looked identical. Taking a deep breath, I decided to retrace my steps. As I turned to head back, a faint rustling sound came from behind me. I froze, straining to listen. The sound ceased, but my heartbeat quickened. Dismissing it, I resumed walking, this time a little faster. A few minutes later, the rustling returned, louder and closer now. Whipping around, I scanned the trees but saw nothing. I quickened my pace, almost breaking into a jog, desperate to find a trail marker. Panic began to bubble up, tightening my chest. Suddenly, I tripped over a root and hit the ground hard. As I pushed myself up, I noticed fresh footprints in the dirt. Prints that weren't mine. My breath caught in my throat. Someone else was out here. Scrambling to my feet, I broke into a run, no longer caring about the noise I made. The forest seemed to press in, the shadows deepening. My ragged breaths and pounding heart were the only sounds accompanying me. After what felt like an eternity, I burst out of the dense woods into an open clearing. The sudden brightness was blinding after the gloom. Panting, I scanned the space anxiously. Across the clearing, I spotted a trail marker. Relief flooded over me, and I hurried toward it, eager to return to the main path. As I reached the marker, I hesitated, glancing back at the woods. The trees stood silent, unmoving. Forcing myself to turn away, I didn't stop until I reached my car. My legs throbbed, and my hands trembled as I unlocked the door. Tossing my gear into the back seat, I climbed in and locked the doors. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, but nothing followed. Once home, curiosity led me to research the area. I stumbled upon reports of unusual occurrences along that trail. One account stood out. A hiker had vanished there years ago and was never found. Rumors suggested his spirit wandered the forest. I wasn't one to believe in such stories, but the eerie sensation of being watched still clung to me. After that, I chose my hiking trails with more caution, sticking to well-trodden routes. Yet, every so often, I dream of that forest. In those dreams, the rustling sound would draw nearer and nearer until I woke up, heart racing, half expecting to find someone standing at the foot of my bed. I had been eagerly anticipating this hike for weeks. The weather was ideal, a bright, cloudless sky paired with a gentle breeze. The trail was renowned for its breathtaking scenery, weaving through dense woods and skirting sharp cliffs. I set off early in the morning, feeling energized and ready for an adventure. As I trekked, the path grew narrower and rockier. The forest thickened around me, and the sounds of chirping birds and buzzing insects filled the air. Lost in thought and enjoying the solitude, I barely noticed the sun dipping lower. I had aimed to reach a small clearing by dusk to pitch my tent, but it was clear I was far from my destination. A sense of unease began to creep in. I quickened my pace, hoping to make up for lost time, but the trail twisted and turned unpredictably. Soon, I found myself in an unfamiliar part of the woods. The trees were taller here, their branches intertwining overhead, and the underbrush was thicker. I realized with a sinking feeling that I must have taken a wrong turn. My heartbeat quickened as I fumbled for my map, but the dimming light made it almost impossible to read. Fighting off panic, I decided to press on, hoping to stumble upon a familiar landmark or another hiker. The forest grew darker and the air colder. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me jump, the isolation pressing in on me. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a faint glow in the distance. Relief washed over me as I headed toward it, praying it was a campsite or someone's cabin. As I drew closer, I discovered it was a small, dilapidated shack. Its windows were shattered, and the door hung crookedly on its hinges. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, and I needed a place to think. Inside, the shack was dusty and filled with broken furniture. I found a spot on the floor and sat down, my heart still racing. I knew I couldn't stay there all night, but with no clear path forward, I decided to wait until morning. In the daylight, I might be able to find my way back to the main trail. I tried to rest, but every sound outside made me jump. The night dragged on endlessly. When the first rays of sunlight filtered through the broken windows, I felt a wave of relief. Gathering my things, I stepped outside. In the daylight, the forest looked less menacing. After about an hour of walking, I came across a familiar marker, a large, oddly shaped boulder. From there, I quickly rediscovered the main trail. The relief was overwhelming. Determined not to repeat my mistake, I hiked with renewed caution, paying close attention to my surroundings. By midday, I reached the clearing where I had originally planned to camp. The ordeal had shaken me, but it also taught me a lesson in preparation and mindfulness. As I set up my tent, I felt a small sense of victory. I had faced a frightening experience and come through it. The remainder of the hike was calm, and I appreciated the forest's beauty with a newfound respect. That night, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard a faint sound outside my tent, a rustling, like dry leaves being disturbed. Assuming it was an animal, I ignored it. But then it came again, this time louder and more deliberate, like footsteps. My body tensed. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. Silence hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Then, slowly, the zipper of my tent began to move. My breath caught as the zipper slid open, inch by inch. A hand appeared, a grimy hand with dirt-caked fingers and jagged nails. I couldn't see who or what it belonged to, but I knew I wasn't alone. My heart pounded as I reached for the nearest object, a flashlight, and swung it at the hand. The hand recoiled instantly, and I heard a guttural growl, something between human and animal. Without thinking, I scrambled out of the tent and bolted into the woods. Branches scratched my skin as I ran, my breaths coming in panicked gasps. I didn't stop until I found myself back on the main trail. Eventually, I made it to my car, trembling and exhausted. I never returned for my tent or the rest of my gear. To this day, I have no idea what or who that hand belonged to. All I know is that I've never felt terror like that before, and the memory of that night still haunts me. A few friends and I decided to go camping for the weekend, hoping to escape the constant noise of the city. We chose a remote location deep in a forest, far from any signs of human activity. As the sun dipped below the horizon, an unsettling sense of unease crept over me. We set up our tents in a small clearing surrounded by towering trees that seemed to loom ominously overhead. The crackling of the campfire was the only sound breaking the heavy stillness of the night. Despite the fire's warmth, a cold shiver ran through me as I gazed into the surrounding darkness. As the hours passed, strange noises began echoing through the woods. Tree branches groaned in the wind, and the rustling of leaves sounded eerily like hushed whispers. I tried to brush off the growing anxiety, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. In the dead of night, I woke to the sound of faint footsteps outside my tent. My heart pounded as I lay still, straining to hear. The steps were slow and deliberate, growing closer with each passing second. I froze, hoping it was just one of my friends returning from a late-night trip to the bushes. But when the footsteps stopped right outside my tent, I knew something was wrong. Sweat trickled down my face as I held my breath, listening intently. The silence was suffocating. Suddenly, something struck the side of my tent with such force that I nearly fell over. I stifled a scream as my hands scrambled for my flashlight. My fingers trembled as I finally turned it on and aimed it toward the disturbance. What I saw chilled me to the core. Just outside my tent stood a shadowy figure, its features obscured in the darkness. Its eyes seemed to pierce through me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Without making a sound, it turned and disappeared into the night, leaving me paralyzed with fear. I wanted to cry out, to alert my friends and run as far as possible, but I was frozen in place. All I could do was lie there, listening to the oppressive silence that seemed to close in around me. When morning finally came, I emerged from my tent, shaken but trying to suppress the memory of the night. My friends were already awake, chatting and preparing breakfast as if nothing had happened. I forced a smile and joined them, desperate to push the experience from my mind. As we packed up and began to leave, a strange feeling lingered, like unseen eyes were watching us from the shadows. The sensation of being followed grew stronger as we made our way through the forest. Just before we reached the edge of the woods, I spotted it again. Among the trees stood the same shadowy figure, its eyes burning with an unsettling intensity. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished into the darkness. Even as we drove away from the campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, silently observing us. I glanced back one last time, and though it seemed irrational, the thought lingered. Somewhere in those woods, something was waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself again. I never imagined I'd wind up in such a predicament. It all started with a casual outing, a trek through the forest with some friends. We assumed wandering through the woods would be simple, but the towering trees blocked most of the sunlight, and eerie shadows seemed to shift around us. As the hours passed, it became clear we were lost. Anxiety took over as we searched desperately for anything familiar, yet all we encountered were more trees. Dusk came quickly, bringing with it a biting cold. Left with no other option, we stumbled upon an abandoned shack. Its windows were covered with planks, and the walls looked weathered and fragile. Despite its unsettling appearance, it seemed a better choice than braving the freezing night outside. Inside, the air was thick and stale, and the floor creaked with every step. We gathered close, trying to stay warm, our nerves frayed by the oppressive silence. Every small sound seemed magnified in the pitch-black darkness. As the hours dragged on, exhaustion overtook me. My eyes grew heavy, and I drifted into a troubled sleep. I awoke suddenly to a disturbing noise, a faint guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. My heart pounded as I strained to listen for more. Then, through a gap in the boarded-up window, I caught sight of them. Two glowing eyes fixed on me. A wave of terror washed over me as I realized we weren't alone. Without hesitation, I shook my friends awake, urging them to leave immediately. We fled the shack, adrenaline fueling our escape as we ran blindly through the dark forest. Only when we were far from the trees did we dare to look back. That's when we saw them. A group of wolves had been stalking us, drawn to our fear. We had barely escaped, but the memory stayed with me, haunting my thoughts as we made our way to safety. I couldn't help but wonder, what if we hadn't found that shack? Would we have become their prey? The idea sent a shiver through me, a chilling reminder of the hidden dangers the wild holds, mysteries darker than I ever imagined. I've always enjoyed the stillness of the forest, so when I stumbled upon an old shack during a hike, I couldn't resist taking a closer look. The evening sun was sinking low, casting long shadows between the trees. As I approached, the shack appeared ancient and abandoned, hidden among thick undergrowth. Stepping inside, a chill ran down my spine. The air was damp and stale, and every step I took made the wooden floor groan. A thick layer of dust coated everything, and it was clear no one had been there for a very long time. Despite the eerie atmosphere, I decided to stay the night. It felt safer than camping under the open sky in the middle of nowhere. As darkness enveloped the forest, the shack seemed to amplify every sound. Each creak and rustle sent shivers down my arms. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but then I heard something outside, slow, deliberate footsteps crunching through the dry leaves. My pulse quickened, and I froze in place, too scared to move. Suddenly, the door burst open, flooding the room with pale moonlight. A shadowy figure filled the doorway, its silhouette sharp against the night. Its gaze felt like it cut right through me, sending a wave of terror through my chest. Overcome by fear, I bolted from the shack, crashing through the underbrush. Branches scraped my skin, and roots caught my feet, but I didn't stop until I reached the safety of civilization. Later, I learned the history of the shack. It had once been home to a reclusive man who lived out his days in isolation. He passed away there, forgotten by the world. Perhaps the footsteps I heard belonged to his restless spirit, lingering in the place where he spent his last moments. That night changed me. I've never ventured into the forest alone since, and even now, the memory haunts my dreams, a reminder of the mysteries hidden in the woods. I hadn't planned to spend the night in that old cabin. I was simply walking through the forest, hoping for some quiet time away from the noise of town. The woods were serene, the kind of place where you could hear your own heartbeat. I wandered off the trail, distracted by the sight of a fox, and before I realized it, the sun had dipped low. The forest darkened quickly, and I soon noticed I had lost my way back to the main path. I tried heading in the direction I thought was correct, but every tree looked the same, and the shadows grew deeper. Panic set in as I quickened my steps, the sky fading to a dark gray. Just when I thought I was stuck for the night, I stumbled upon a tiny, weathered cabin. It looked deserted, but it was a shelter, and I was thankful for it. Inside, the air was musty, and the wooden floor groaned with every step I took. The furniture was ancient, draped in cobwebs and dust, but there was a fireplace with a few logs stacked nearby. I started a fire, its warmth chasing away the chill of the evening. Searching through a creaky cupboard, I found a couple of canned goods and opened one with my pocket knife. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me going. As the fire crackled, I began to relax. The cabin felt like a small shield against the vast unknowns of the dark woods outside. But the peace didn't last long. Strange noises began to fill the silence. At first, it was just the wind murmuring through the trees and rattling the loose shutters. Then came the sound of footsteps outside, slow, deliberate steps. I froze, straining my ears to listen. The steps moved around the cabin, steady and cautious. I tried to convince myself it was just some animal. But then came a scratching noise at the door, deliberate and persistent, as though something or someone was trying to get inside. My chest tightened as my heartbeat thundered in my ears. Grabbing a sturdy iron rod from beside the fireplace, I braced myself. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie stillness. Every sound seemed amplified in the quiet of the night. Suddenly, the door creaked open just a sliver, and I caught a glimpse of movement. I raised the rod, ready to defend myself, when a low growl stopped me in my tracks. Standing in the doorway was a large animal, more wolf than dog. Its eyes glowed eerily in the light of the fire. It stepped inside, sniffing the air, as I backed away cautiously, never looking away. After a few tense moments, it turned and slipped back into the darkness as quietly as it had appeared. I bolted the door and sat close to the fire, my body tense and on edge. Sleep was out of the question, so I fed the fire and watched the flickering shadows on the walls. The hours dragged on until finally, the sky began to brighten. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the grimy windows, I felt a heavy weight lift from my chest. Packing up my belongings, I left the cabin behind, eager to return to the safety of the main trail. In the daylight, the forest seemed less menacing, and I soon found my way back to the path and eventually to my car. I didn't tell anyone about that night. It felt too bizarre, too surreal to explain. But every time I think about going back into the woods, I remember that cabin, those footsteps, and the glowing eyes in the doorway. Keeps me close to the trails where sunlight can reach. Months later, I heard about people disappearing in those same woods, campers and hikers who were never seen again. Their campsites were found abandoned, their belongings untouched. Stories of eerie noises at night, footsteps, and scratching sounds were all too familiar. Each time I hear those tales, I feel a chill run down my spine, wondering what might have happened if I hadn't found that cabin, or if I had stayed there longer. The sun was dipping below the horizon as I strolled along the narrow trail winding through the woods. I had thought I could squeeze in a quick walk before nightfall, but I hadn't realized how quickly the daylight would fade. Now the shadows stretched longer, and the air turned cooler. I knew I needed to hurry back to my car. The trail became harder to discern, and a sense of unease crept into my chest. I glanced at my watch. Just 25 minutes left until complete darkness. I quickened my pace, but the dense trees obscured most of the remaining light. The forest felt eerily quiet, with only the occasional rustling of leaves breaking the stillness. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. I veered off the path without realizing it until a few minutes later when the trail seemed unfamiliar. Panic surged as I tried to retrace my steps, but everything around me appeared identical in the dim light. The trees towered above, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal fingers. Cold sweat trickled down my spine. I paused to gather my thoughts and pulled out my phone, only to find there was no signal. Frustration bubbled up, and I muttered a curse under my breath, the isolation hitting me harder than ever. I remembered advice I'd once read. Stay calm in situations like this. Taking a deep breath, I forced myself to focus. The last remnants of light were nearly gone. I had to choose, keep moving or stay put until sunrise. I decided to keep walking, clinging to the hope of finding something familiar. My footsteps crunched over fallen leaves and twigs, each sound echoing in the quiet. The uncertainty of my surroundings tightened its grip on me. After what seemed like an eternity, I stumbled upon a small brook. Relief flooded me as I recognized it from earlier. If I followed the stream downstream, it would eventually lead me back to the main trail. Carefully, I navigated the bank, the sound of running water soothing my nerves somewhat. By the time I saw the faint glimmer of my car's headlights in the distance, darkness had fully enveloped the forest. My legs felt weak, but the sight of my car gave me the resolve to press on. Reaching it, I collapsed into the seat, panting and drained, but safe. I sat there for a moment, breathing deeply as the adrenaline ebbed away. The experience taught me a sobering lesson. I had underestimated the wilderness and overestimated my preparedness. As I drove away, a mix of relief and lingering unease filled me. I vowed to be more cautious in the future, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest hadn't entirely let me go. Just as I left the woods behind, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror, a fleeting shadow darting across the trail and disappearing behind a tree. I told myself it was nothing more than my imagination playing tricks on me, but the uneasiness lingered long after I got home. The thought stayed with me. Something or someone might still be out there, waiting for my return. I had been eagerly anticipating this hike for weeks. The weather was ideal, and the trail was said to offer some of the most stunning vistas in the region. I packed my backpack with the necessities: water, snacks, a map, and my reliable headlamp. My plan was straightforward: start early, reach the summit by midday, and return well before nightfall. I'd done similar hikes in the past and felt confident. The initial stretch was smooth, the path was clear, and I passed a few other hikers along the way. Everyone exchanged friendly greetings, a nod here, a smile there. But as I climbed higher, the crowd thinned. By late morning, I found myself alone. The forest grew denser, with towering trees casting long shadows that blocked out much of the sunlight. The air was cooler here, damp with the earthy scent of moss and soil. I welcomed the solitude, accompanied by the gentle symphony of chirping birds, rustling leaves, and the faint gurgle of a distant stream. Around noon, I reached the peak. The view was breathtaking. Rolling hills unfolded before me in hues of green and gold beneath a vibrant azure sky. I sat down to enjoy my packed lunch, savoring the moment. It was for scenes like this that I endured the effort. After some time, I decided it was time to head back. I didn't want to risk being caught on the trail after sundown. As I descended, I realized I hadn't encountered any other hikers for a while. The trail ahead began to feel unfamiliar. I pulled out my map and compass, but everything appeared correct. I reassured myself to stay calm and continue forward. An hour passed, then another. Shadows deepened as the forest grew darker. A nagging worry crept into my mind. Had I wandered off the trail? I checked my map again, but it didn't match my surroundings. My phone had no service, and its battery was quickly draining. I decided to conserve power, relying instead on my headlamp, which barely pierced the growing gloom. My footsteps echoed eerily, and the forest seemed unnaturally silent. Panic began to set in. I quickened my pace, my breathing becoming shallow and hurried. Every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig sent a jolt through me. I couldn't shake the unnerving sensation of being watched, even though logic told me it was just my imagination. Exhausted and anxious, I stumbled on unseen roots and jagged rocks, my legs growing weak. At one point, I tripped and fell hard, scraping my knee and tearing my pants. I sat there for a moment, catching my breath and suppressing a surge of tears. Then I heard it, a low, steady hum. A flicker of hope reignited within me. I followed the sound, cautiously but determined. The hum grew louder, and soon I saw a faint glow through the trees. It was a road with a car moving slowly along it. Stumbling out onto the roadside, I waved my arms frantically. The car came to a stop, and the driver, a kind man in his 50s, rolled down the window asking if I was all right. I explained my predicament, and he offered me a ride to the nearest town. As I sank into the passenger seat, a wave of relief washed over me. I was safe. I thanked the man profusely. He smiled, explaining he had hiked in these woods before and understood how easily one could lose their way. When we arrived in the small town, I stepped out of the car, expressing my gratitude once more as he drove off. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the day's events in my mind. The experience had shaken me, but I also felt a strange sense of accomplishment. I had faced my fears and emerged unscathed. I resolved to hike again, but next time I would be better prepared. The wilderness was beautiful, yes, but it also demanded respect. As I drifted towards sleep, I thought I heard a faint rustling outside my window. My eyes snapped open, and I lay there, heart pounding, listening intently. The sound came again, a soft, hesitant scratching against the glass. I told myself it was just the wind, a branch swaying against the pane. Anything but what my mind feared it might be. Gathering my courage, I forced myself out of bed. My feet felt leaden as I shuffled toward the window. Pulling back the curtain, I expected to see nothing. But there, etched into the glass, were fresh scratches, deep and deliberate, the kind no tree branch could make. My breath caught as I noticed movement in the shadows outside. A figure lingered, just out of reach, before vanishing into the night. I stepped back, my mind racing with unanswerable questions and primal fears. Sleep eluded me. The forest, once a haven of serenity and wonder, now seemed shrouded in menace. Somewhere out there, in the enveloping darkness, something was waiting, watching. Last weekend, I decided to check out a trail I'd heard about that was about 2 hours away from where I live. It wasn't a popular route, which made it perfect for some peaceful time outdoors. I packed my backpack, grabbed a trail guide, and left early in the morning. When I reached the starting point, there was no one else around. No cars, no hikers, just the sound of birds singing and the wind rustling through the trees. I felt both eager and slightly nervous. The trail looked well marked at the beginning, so I didn't feel too concerned. About an hour into my walk, I came to a split in the trail. My guide didn't show this fork, but I decided to take the path on the right, hoping it would eventually loop back. As I went further, the path became harder to follow. Dense bushes crowded the sides, and the tree canopy overhead blocked most of the sunlight. The forest grew quieter. The cheerful birdsong faded, replaced by an unsettling stillness. The trail, now barely visible, led me through thick undergrowth. When I checked my watch, I saw it was already past midday. I decided to press on, hoping to find a more open path. Not long after, I came upon an old, crumbling bridge over a narrow stream. It looked like it had been there for decades, with moss-covered beams and decaying wood. Carefully, I tested it with my foot. It groaned but didn't collapse. Holding my breath, I began to cross. Halfway across, a sharp cracking noise rang out, and before I could react, the bridge gave way. I tumbled into the shallow stream below, hitting the rocky bed with a jarring thud. Pain shot through my leg as I scrambled to the bank. My leg was bruised, but thankfully, it didn't seem broken. Looking around, I realized the dense forest had disoriented me. I couldn't figure out where I had come from. With no clear path ahead, I decided to follow the stream, hoping it would lead me to a larger body of water or something recognizable. The sun was sinking lower, and the forest grew darker with every passing moment. My heart pounded as I trudged on, trying to stay calm. Just as despair started creeping in, I heard the faint sound of rushing water. Energized, I moved faster and soon came to a larger river. Relief swept over me. Following the river downstream, I reasoned that it would eventually lead me to people. As darkness fell, I spotted the flicker of a campfire in the distance. I called out, my voice hoarse from hours of yelling. A group of campers answered and helped me over to their site. They offered me food, water, and a warm place to rest. The next morning, they guided me back to the main trail and eventually to my car. Exhausted and sore, I was overwhelmed with gratitude. That experience taught me how crucial it is to be prepared and respect the power of the wilderness. As I drove home, a strange feeling crept over me, as if I was being watched. In my rearview mirror, I thought I glimpsed a shadow darting between the trees. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the dim light. Yet, even now, when I'm alone in the woods, I can't shake the sensation that something unseen is watching me. That hike reminded me that nature is breathtaking but also holds its own dangers.